Now we're going to talk about how bones are formed. So bone formation, we can also call that ossification or osteogenesis, all means the same thing. So bone formation, this ossification, will begin during the embryonic period. So this is fetal development before the child is even born. So this is all taking place in the mother's womb. There are two mechanisms by which bones can form: intramembranous ossification and endochondral ossification. Intramembranous, intra within, membranous, a membrane. And this membrane is going to be, if you recall from chapter 4, a membrane is a flat sheet of one or more tissues, right? And the membrane in this case will be a membrane of embryonic connective tissue called mesenchyme. The other form of bone formation or ossification is endochondral ossification. Endo within, chondral, remember chondra, that's cartilage. So this particular type of bone formation will actually happen from a hyaline cartilage scaffold. So it starts as hyaline cartilage. Think of it, hyaline cartilage, as like the modeling clay, and then the bone is built from that first, okay? All right, so this video we're going to talk about intramembranous ossification and the bones of the skull as well as the clavicles. So pretty much the bones of the cranium, facial skeleton, all form through intramembranous ossification. The only bones below the head that form via intramembranous ossification will be the clavicles. All other bones in the body will undergo that endochondral ossification, which will be in the next video. Now, in both cases, what forms first will be a primary bone. And primary bone is softer, so it's not nearly as calcified, so it's not nearly as hard. And then over time, the primary bone gets replaced with secondary bone, which will have the collagen fibers oriented in the correct direction, in the correct orientation, to be able to withstand those twisting tension forces. And then the big difference will be that secondary bone will be a lot more calcified, therefore much harder. Okay? It makes sense that the first type of bone that we want to lay down, especially in a fetal skeleton, would be a softer, more pliable bone, which once the bone gets the appropriate shape and is formed correctly, then a secondary, more calcified hard bone will replace that. Okay, it kind of makes sense. Okay, and then so we're going to talk about intramembranous ossification first, and a key here is that to remember what those flat bones of the skull look like, and remember it's kind of like a bone sandwich in that you have the periosteum on the outer side. Remember, periosteum always wraps around the bone tissue. We have our compact bone, which is kind of like the bread of the sandwich. Your book uses this analogy. The outer compact bone is kind of like the bread. And then the inner meat of the sandwich is going to be that spongy bone that houses and protects all of the red bone marrow. So it's kind of like a bone sandwich. Now that middle spongy layer, the spongy bone, will actually ossify first, and then the compact bone on the outside forms afterwards. So it's spongy bone first and then compact bone on the periphery. So let's go through the steps of intramembranous ossification, and what I talk about will be what I ask as far as what level of detail do you need to know. And I think the book does a very good job of putting it in a stepwise fashion for you to just really break it down and understand. But the level at which I talk about it will be how I'll ask it on the exam. So the first thing that happens in intramembranous ossification, we have our mesenchymal tissue. And remember, mesenchymal tissue, all of this red stuff, we see collagen fibers, and then we see these red cells represent mesenchymal cells. This is semi-differentiated connective tissue. And what I mean by semi-differentiated is that it's embryonic connective tissue. It is a connective tissue, but it's not specialized yet. That's what I mean by semi-undifferentiated. It has not yet differentiated into a specific type of connective tissue. So it's like the fetal skeleton knows it's supposed to be connective tissue, but what kind? We don't know yet, until the appropriate chemical cues are present. And we're not going to go into all the mechanisms of that, but there are particular chemical cues that will happen, and those chemical cues, those signals, will tell these mesenchymal cells to differentiate, meaning specialize, into osteoblasts. Okay? So the appropriate chemical signals come along and trigger these mesenchymal cells to differentiate into osteoblasts. And when they differentiate into osteoblasts, they are now specialized, and we call this the primary ossification center. Now, these osteoblasts in the primary ossification center, what's the function of osteoblast? We talked about this in a previous video. Osteoblasts will start their younger, more metabolically active bone-forming cells, and they'll start to lay down osteoid. Remember, osteoid is the organic matrix. Okay, the organic matrix is pretty much all of the other components like collagen fibers and the extracellular matrix that is not inorganic salts. It's everything else. So these osteoblasts start to lay down the osteoid. That becomes calcified over time, and then eventually these osteoblasts surround themselves by this bone matrix. And what happens when they get surrounded? Now they're in their little lacunae, their little house, right? And so once these osteoblasts get completely surrounded by bone matrix, they are now mature osteocytes. And their job, remember osteocytes, their job is just to maintain that bone. Okay? They don't form new bone, they maintain the current bone. And then out here, so we have osteoblasts. Again, more mesenchymal cells will differentiate or specialize into osteoblast, and they're going to be located around the periphery. They are going to continue to lay down they're going to lay down bone as well. Okay. Now, embryonic mesenchymal tissue is very highly vascularized. So there are lots of blood vessels present in this mesenchyme. And the bone that gets secreted or formed by these osteoblasts will get laid down around these blood vessels. And that is how spongy bone is formed. The blood vessels are present, and bone gets laid down around those blood vessels, forming that porous, spongy-like bone of the center of these flat bones. All right. So osteoblasts lay down bone around the blood vessels, and that's what gives it its spongy appearance. Same thing as the osteoblasts get surrounded by bone matrix, they become osteocytes. Now look at where the osteoblasts are located, right? These guys are surrounded by bone tissue, so these are osteocytes. The osteoblasts get pushed to the periphery, and they're sandwiched in between the mesenchymal tissue that remains, all right? Okay, what happens next is as the bone is being laid down around these blood vessels, the mesenchymal tissue that gets pushed to the periphery starts to specialize into the periosteum, right? This is all a result of chemical signals in the developing fetus, okay? So the mesenchymal tissue that gets pushed to the periphery will then become the periosteum. And remember, the periosteum is that layer of that dense, irregular-ish, vascularized connective tissue that surrounds the bone. And then over time, what happens is, okay, so now we have the osteocytes surrounded by their bone matrix. Okay, the bone got laid down around the blood vessels, so that's what gives the spongy appearance. The mesenchymal tissue on the periphery specialized into the periosteum, so it differentiated and became periosteum. And these osteoblasts that are sandwiched in between, right, that are next to the periosteum, they just keep laying down more and more bone, and that bone becomes compact bone. And that's how compact bone gets on the periphery. And we have, look, our periosteum, we have our compact bone, and then in the center we have our spongy bone. So spongy bone forms first around the blood vessels, then that periosteum specializes, and then compact bone gets laid down there. Now this layer of osteoblast will remain here because throughout the lifetime of an individual, there'll be some slight remodeling of bone. And so osteoblast will be, if you remember me talking about the periosteum, and one of the functions of the periosteum is not only, it supplies blood vessels and nervous tissue to the bone, and it provides a protective sheet around the bone, but another function of the periosteum is to provide bone-forming cells, okay? And so osteoblasts are found right there in that periosteum as well. And I like this. I stole this from one of my previous PowerPoints. I think it's a little more simplified to look at. So with intramembranous ossification, you have one ossification center called the primary ossification center. Mesenchymal cells get a chemical signal to differentiate into osteoblast. Those osteoblasts immediately start to secrete, once they have specialized into osteoblast, secrete bone matrix. When those osteoblasts get surrounded by their bone matrix and it becomes calcified over time, look, they're in their little lacunae, they now are going to mature into osteocytes. Osteoblasts remain around the periphery and they continue to secrete bone matrix. Now, mesenchymal tissue, which again, mesenchymal tissue is embryonic connective tissue, is very well vascularized. And so the bone that gets laid down by these osteoblasts will be laid down around the blood vessels, giving it its spongy appearance. The mesenchymal tissue around the periphery will specialize into the periosteum. Those osteoblasts that are sandwiched in between the bone and the periosteum will continue to secrete more and more, lay down more and more bone, forming a layer of compact bone on the outside of this spongy bone. And so here, this is our bone sandwich. We have our outer periosteum. We have osteoblasts, which are sandwiched in between the periosteum and the bone itself. We have the compact bone, which is kind of like the bread. And then the middle meat of the sandwich is our spongy bone. And the blood vessels that are here, that the bone got laid down around, those blood vessels will specialize into red bone marrow. So eventually, those blood vessels will become red bone marrow.